I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, all Jewish eyes are turned towards Israel as the Jewish world awaits the results of Tuesday's Israeli elections. Will Prime Minister Netanyahu pull it out of the fire and continue to lead Likud and its party dominance that began 6 years ago? Or will Issac Herzog and Tzipi Livni bring in a win for the Zionist Union, which, if they win, will be the first time in 16 years that a labor coalition will have won an Israeli election? And what about the names that have become well known to American Jews conversant with Israeli politics? What about Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid? And is Avigdor Lieberman done? And who's this new kid on the block, Moshe Kachlon of the Kulanu party? Is he destined to be the next finance minister no matter who wins the election? And what about the ultra-Orthodox religious parties? Will they be a player in the next attempt to form a coalition government? And what about the fact that the Arab parties have now united and seem to be headed for a block of 13 seats? Could Arab parties actually be included in a left-leaning coalition government? And if Bougie Herzog wins the most seats and is given the first crack at forming a coalition government, will he try to reach the magic number of 61 seats by bringing the ultra-Orthodox parties into the coalition? And will the Orthodox ever agree to a government that includes Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid party, which has campaigned on eliminating Orthodox preferences in terms of military service and government subsidies? Or, if Herzog goes for the Arab parties, would Kachlon and others ever agree to serve in a coalition with those Arab parties? And so, as complicated and exciting as American elections are in this country, you get a sense of how complicated and exciting they can be in Israel. And to help us unravel the complexities, we're very pleased to have our phones right now from Israel, the director of the Argov Center for the Study of Israel and the Jewish People, and the author of The Israel Paradox, the Arab-Israeli Conflict in American Political Culture, Dr. Jonathan Ryhnold. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Well, Jonathan, you heard my open. Is it as exciting for you as I describe it? Is this as somebody who's watching Israeli politics all the time, is this a time, where you get a kick out of this, or is it boring like crazy?
Well, I think it's going to be interesting for people like myself who follow these things closely, because it looks like neither the center, the left, and the Arab bloc on the one hand, nor the right and the religious bloc on the other hand, are going to have a blocking majority of 61 seats.
Yes.
So it means that the result of the election will probably be very unclear. But for most Israelis, I think they're pretty fed up, and they are not fascinated or thrilled by this election, because they think that a lot of the problems that Israel faces, particularly in the foreign and defense and peace process areas, it will make very little difference which way they vote.
Interesting. Jonathan, in America, American Jewry is fixated on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Iranian nuclear threat. What are the issues that you see driving the Israeli electorate in this election? What concerns Israelis most today?
Well, I think you have to think about what's the most important political issue for Israelis, and then you have to ask a different question, which is what's the most important political question for Israelis in this election? And there are two different answers, because the underlying most important question is exactly what you spoke about, which is the Iranian threat and the threat of terrorism and violence and the peace process. But as I mentioned before, the fact is that Israelis think that there is no partner on the Palestinian front, and that the Iranian threat is a threat whoever we elect, and it makes little difference in that way. So what they say to themselves is, okay, what can I do with my vote? Where can I make a difference? Where can I change the reality? And for that part of the electorate which is in the middle, which actually could change its vote from left to right, That's the central question. And the answer they've given is, well, it's really the cost of living. The cost of living has gone up. And so when you ask Israelis in poll after poll, they say that is the issue which will determine their vote. And we're really talking about that part of the electorate that might change its vote from one party bloc to another bloc. But we're also talking about Israeli Arabs, because a majority of them also see economic issues rather than the peace process as the most important issue.
Yes. By the way, Jonathan, to what extent has the Arab Palestinian Israeli community, the Arab Israeli, been a bloc unto itself that in some way can influence the outcome of an election?
Well, in between 1992 and 1995, when we had the beginnings of the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and a Labour government, that government relied on support from the Arab parties. Even though those parties were not part of the coalition, the fact that they agreed that they would not seek to bring the government down meant that the government had a majority in the Knesset, without which it would have fallen. So potentially the Arab parties have a big role to play. The problem is that while their public is very much in favor of them taking an active role and maybe joining even a left-leaning coalition, 2 out of the 3 parties that make up the Arab United List are radically anti-Zionist, either Arab nationalist or Islamist, which leaves only a third that is kind of more practical, pragmatic, more interested in kind of socioeconomic issues.
So is it conceivable to you that if Herzog were to win it's interesting, Americans sometimes don't understand. The closest thing I can think of, Jonathan, is that in America it is conceivable from time to time that a presidential candidate could win the popular vote but lose in the electoral college and therefore would not become president. In some way you have a similar situation in which it is possible for a party to win the most seats of any party but still be unable to put a coalition together that would reach the 61 number threshold necessary to have a ruling coalition. And so it could be possible that, for example, Herzog might get more votes than Netanyahu, but it would be Netanyahu who would have a better chance of putting together a 61-seat coalition. One of the questions that I hear discussed all the time now is if Herzog wins and gets the first chance, given the chance by the Israeli president, to form the first coalition government, would Herzog dare bring in Arab parties into the coalition, and could he maintain the other members of the coalition if he brought in Arab parties?
Well, this is Herzog's big problem. Herzog's big problem is that there are certainly enough parties in the Knesset that he could theoretically that would be willing to join his government. The problem is that they wouldn't sit with each other very easily.
Yes.
So, for example, some of the Arabs in the list, right, might be willing to join his coalition, maybe, but he would probably need a more center-right or right-wing or religious party as well. And the question is, would a left-wing party like Meretz or an Arab party be willing to sit with them? Would the ultra-Orthodox be willing to sit with Yesh Atid? They've said they wouldn't be. So Herzog's great difficulty would be that his potential coalition partners wouldn't sit with each other, even though they would sit with him.
Yes.
Which is why I think, at the end of the day, the most likely scenario of all of this is probably a national unity government involving both Labour, a Zionist union, and Likud.
Really? You could see Herzog, Livni, and Netanyahu working together in a unity government?
Well, I didn't say working together. I said being in a unity government. We have had unity governments before that lasted between 1984 and 1990 for 6 years, which is a long period.
Yes.
And in many ways, the gaps on the peace process were much larger in the 1980s than they are today. So I don't see any reason why they can't form such a government. But I think, obviously, such a government would be unwieldy and difficult to maneuver, but it may be the easiest option available to both of them.
What we see right now, Jonathan, is that Herzog has pulled ahead of Netanyahu. First of all, is that what you're seeing as well?
Yes, but it's misleading for the reasons that you said, because
yes.
What we really have to look at is blocs. That is, there are many, many parties in Israel, but they roughly define themselves as blocs. So you have the right-wing parties, you have the ultra-Orthodox parties, you have the center parties, the left parties, and the Arab parties. Herzog has gained from center and left. The center and the left haven't really got more votes than they had more at the start of this campaign. The really big thing to watch is that in the current Knesset, there are 61 seats for the right and the ultra-Orthodox, which meant that Netanyahu had to be prime minister because no left-wing candidate could get a majority.
Yes.
This time, the right and the religious parties are polling between 57 and 60. In other words, they do not have, they cannot have an absolute majority. That's what's really important, not so much that Herzog's gone up. It's that the right is going to lose its blocking majority, and therefore it's unclear who will be prime minister. And that is why I think that we'll probably end up with a national unity government, because the right will need at least one centrist party. And Netanyahu is worried that with the Palestinians making moves in the UN and a lot of pressure on the Iranian issue, that without a left-wing party to protect him from international pressure, it will be very, very tough. Herzog will probably not be able to form a majority coalition without a national unity government. Therefore, there are forces pushing them together.
By the way, Jonathan, tell me what's wrong with this analysis. The parties that are normally associated on the right include Likud, Jewish Home, Yisrael Beitenu. Those, if they joined a coalition with Kulanu, they would have 48 seats, roughly 48 seats. If the ultra-Orthodox joined that coalition, they'd be well over 61. Why couldn't Netanyahu put that coalition together? Likud, Jewish Home, Israel Beitenu, Kulanu, and ultra-Orthodox.
He could, but there are two problems with that. The first one is that I think Kahlon would prefer a national unity government. The second problem is it won't help him in the international arena. As I mentioned before, he knows he's going to come under a lot of pressure, both from the United States and in the international arena. There's a very important resolution being tabled in the UN Security Council, which could be as significant as UN Resolution 242, which is what allows Israel to hold territory until such time as the Arabs are willing to give it peace and security. It could change that. And Netanyahu knows that Kahlon, who's mainly focused on domestic issues and wants to be finance minister, cannot protect him on that ground. And he went out of his way in the previous elections to always make sure he has someone to his left,
yes,
who's credible. So he had Ehud Barak, and then he had Tzipi Livni. I think he would not want to be exposed because the result of that would be that Israel would pay certain prices, and that would expose the right then also to further criticism from Israelis themselves, and then the coalition may fail for domestic reasons, never mind the damage being done to Israel in the international arena. So you're right that theoretically Kahlon plus the ultra-Orthodox plus the right could work, but I think Netanyahu will try very hard to avoid that.
Very interesting. Jonathan, what happened to Netanyahu's popularity? He was very popular at one point during the Gaza war, and when he, in essence, basically fired Lapid and Livni, and now there were going to be new elections, he was pretty confident that he could win. What do you think cost him whatever popularity he had at that point in time, sort of at the end of the summer?
Well, I think so long as the war was going on, then everyone got behind the government and the prime minister. But course, when the war ends, there was always going to be a problem for the Prime Minister because half of Israelis thought that Israel should go on and uproot Hamas and completely take over Gaza, and half thought they should stop where they stopped. So there's no way to win that one. What happened was the Prime Minister's standing on peace and security in general fell. But here's the interesting thing. It fell mainly among people who vote for the right anyway. And actually, some of the centrists and on the left thought the Prime Minister did pretty in the war. And so the strange thing about that is that it probably, even though his standing overall went down, it probably worked to his favor overall in the electoral balance because the people in the middle, his standing was pretty good after that war. What he may have done to damage that was by going to speak in Congress when there was a sense that by doing so, he damaged bipartisan support for Israel because there, on that issue, while the overwhelming majority of Israelis think that Netanyahu is right and Obama's wrong on the Iran question itself, a narrower majority thought that the Prime Minister made a mistake by going to speak to Congress, even though they liked what he said.
Interesting. I want you to develop that point one more moment for me, Jonathan. Again, it's gotten so much attention here in America and on the American Jewish scene, but in the American scene in general. Are you suggesting that Bibi, ironically, hurt his chances politically to win the most seats in the upcoming election because he, in fact, came to Congress and spoke to a joint session of Congress about what he considers to be a bad deal that he fears the American administration is about to enter?
Well, I think the effects probably cancelled themselves out for the Likud. In other words, those on the right who might have voted for Jewish Home were impressed by what he did and might now go back to the Likud. And those in the centre who maybe were thinking of voting for him, maybe they've kind of said, well, actually, maybe we'll vote for Kahlon or we'll vote for Yesh Atid. So it probably cancels itself out, but that's for the Likud. But if indeed he's actually lost somewhat of the centrist vote and only gained from within the right-wing bloc votes, then his chances overall of forming a government would have been harmed because his bloc as a whole has slightly less seats than it would have done otherwise. But I don't think that speech is going to have a huge impact.
I agree.
On the Israeli election.
I agree. Although I do want to push you one more moment. For the Israelis who were upset that Netanyahu came and spoke to Congress, what was the reason that they were upset?
Well, I think that for Israelis, we recently did some polling at Bar Ilan, and we showed that the Israeli public was asked what's the most important factors to Israeli security. And the number one thing, unsurprisingly, was the power of the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israeli army. But the second most important thing was Israel's relationship with the United States. Mm-hmm. What's really interesting is this was deemed more important than the peace agreement with Egypt, the peace agreement with Jordan, peace with the Palestinians, and the settlements. And what's even more interesting is even people who define themselves as right-wing thought the relationship with the U.S. was more important to Israeli security than the settlements. Mm-hmm. So when Netanyahu was seen as perhaps damaging the relationship by making it partisan, by making it look that Israel was somehow taking sides here with the Republicans against the Democrats, a number of Israelis who follow, Israelis follow America enough to understand that, thought that he'd done some damage to the relationship and perhaps he should have chosen a different forum to speak, one that wouldn't have generated that kind of damage. So even though they agreed with him, as I said, overwhelmingly agreed that he's right about the Iran deal and that Obama's wrong about it, they felt that nonetheless he was doing damage to the relationship. I mean, another interesting thing on this was that the Israeli public thinks that if it comes to it and Israel has to use force to prevent Iran becoming a nuclear weapon state, it should do so. But then when you ask the question, do you still think that Israel should use force to do that if the U.S. opposes it, then a narrow majority say, no, Israel shouldn't use force. And That's how important Israelis see the relationship with America.
Very, very, very interesting. You know, there were many American Jews who argued that Netanyahu only came to Congress to help himself in the Israeli elections. It would be ironic if in some way Netanyahu's coming to Congress, and many others felt he felt compelled to do so, because there was a very brief window between the time he could come and the time this deal on March 24th is supposed to take place. Most Americans do not understand that, again, regardless of the outcome of the elections on the 17th, it takes time for one or more individuals to try to put together a coalition government. It wasn't like it's going to be done on the 18th and 19th. It could be a week. It could be 2 weeks before we know who's running the coalition government next. But in America, there were Jews who were saying, you see, Netanyahu's only coming because he wants to help himself in the polls. And you're saying, ironically, it may have hurt him in the polls.
Yes, I think it's a little bit unfair to say that the Prime Minister only came for domestic political reasons. I mean, I'm sure, like all politicians, he thinks about such things. But he's been committed for a very long time to preventing Iran going nuclear. He's had a long-standing disagreement with the President Obama. Things are coming to a head because the negotiations with Iran are due to end a week or two after the Israeli elections, and it won't take a week or two to form an Israeli government after the election. It will take a month or two.
Yes,
and therefore he in terms of the timing, I don't think one can blame him.
I agree.
I think in terms of the way the whole thing was handled, then I think there's more room for criticism.
I agree. I agree with you 100%. But what are some of the other criticisms of Netanyahu? And I say that knowing how American politics works. You know, Jonathan, when any party or individual is in power for a period of time, a Democratic electorate tends to want change. And so in part I say to myself, no matter how wonderful Netanyahu may or may not be, I could understand that the Israeli people would now say, we want to change. But I am curious, I hear the elections have been really dirty, terrible politics in Israel. What are the criticisms I would be hearing on Israeli television or reading in the Israeli press about Netanyahu?
As you know, Israeli politics is pretty forthright, pretty out there, and pretty direct. You would be hearing a number of things. You would be hearing claims that Netanyahu spends an inordinate amount of state money on in his own home for very, huge bills for sushi. Sarah Netanyahu for an extravagant lifestyle.
Jonathan, are these legitimate?
We're not talking about issues which indicate serious corruption or serious mismanagement or major character flaws of the Prime Minister himself. And I don't think they make a huge difference. I think that many people on the right here feel that the media is very pro-left, so they just simply dismiss those kind of things. I don't think it has the effect that those who sling the mud think it will have.
All right, what are the big issues? What are the substantive issues? Criticisms?
The substantive issues is interesting in the sense that there was just a leak in Yediot Ahronot, one of Israel's leading newspapers, which claimed that Netanyahu, during the previous round of negotiations, made moves towards some major concessions, including accepting in principle the idea of a Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders, not on the borders but based on it with swaps. And that was leaked by a left-wing journalist who was hoping that it would do damage with Netanyahu supporters and make them flee to the more right-wing party, Bayit HaYehudi, so that would help Herzog by making his party appear much bigger than the Likud. So how about that for a twisted
amazing
to make an issue an election issue?
Amazing. Okay, we have very little time left. There's so much I want to ask you, but take a moment to just give me a thumbnail on Bennett, Lapid, and Avigdor Lieberman. What do you expect their fortunes to be in this election?
Well, let's start with Lieberman. I mean, he was thinking that he could become the next leader of the right and prime minister.
Yes.
His party is now on the electoral threshold.
Yes.
If they drop any lower, he'll be wiped out.
Yes.
And as we get closer to election day, there is a chance that voters will move from his party to the Likud because they'll try and boost the Likud to make it a larger party to somehow influence the president's decision of who gets the first shot at trying to form a coalition. So I think there is a big question mark over his political future. In his case, the claims of corruption against people within his parties are far more serious, far more substantive, and it's very hard to say that either he doesn't know and he didn't know and it doesn't matter because he should have known, or he did know and that's even worse. So I think he's got real problems. Naftali Bennett has done very well. He's maintained at the least strength of his party. They go up and down, but I imagine they'll get something close to what they get last time. But his dreams of being a finance minister or defense minister or foreign minister, I think, are going to come to naught. I can't see him having any of those roles. Yair Lapid is polling at about 12 seats, which is what he was polling at last time round, but he managed to go up to 19 in the final days when you don't have polls in Israel because the law is such that they don't want polls to influence voting. So I think that he has actually held his own surprisingly well.
Yes.
However, the problem for him is that if the ultra-Orthodox parties, or at least two of them, Shas and Agudat Yisrael, get more seats than him, it's very unlikely that he'll be in any governing coalition because Netanyahu broke up the government to protect his alliance with the ultra-Orthodox. And it's hard to see that Herzog will just need the numbers, and he would just have to go with who's got more numbers. So if Lapid could get up to 14, 15, then he's got a good chance of being in a government. If he's only on 12 and the ultra-Orthodox parties are on between 14 to 17, then he will probably be out.
Very interesting, very interesting. And what about Kulanu and Kahlon? Where does he stand?
I think he is the kingmaker. I think that, as you mentioned before, Netanyahu almost certainly won't be able to have a coalition without him. Herzog won't be able to have a coalition without him, and I would say there's a very high chance that he will get the job that he wants, which is finance minister. And then the race will be on because that is where the expectations of the Israeli public is. He's the man that brought down cell phone prices in Israel from one of the most expensive countries in the world to one of the cheapest. And people will be looking to him to lower the cost of living, to lower the cost of properties, to lower the cost of food, and to lower the cost of banking.
Very interesting. In 30 seconds, do you expect, Jonathan, the government, the new government, to move to the right or to the left from where this government is today?
I think that we will have a government which is slightly to the left of where it is today in terms of how it sounds rhetorically, what it looks like externally. But I think that actually Netanyahu's policies were far more centrist and far more directed towards compromise than is commonly realized. And so I expect the underlying positions to not be that different from those that were in the previous government. It's wonderful talking to you, Jonathan. You bring terrific insight. I hope you let me call you again, maybe as the elections are in process or right afterward. But I appreciate your time, and I'm going to call you again. I look forward to speaking to you often. My pleasure, Mark. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Dr. Jonathan Ryhnold, Director of the Argov Center for the Study of Israel and the Jewish People. As we approach the Israeli elections on Tuesday, I hope he's given you a little bit of a sense of the political landscape in the state of Israel. As always, my thanks to Sloan Copeland, Serge Goldberg, and to our producer for this edition of In the News, Ron Jacobsohn. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.